Some discoveries change the direction of a day. Others change everything else. Officer George Kemp had worked search and rescue for 5 years. He had found hikers who misjudged the weather, children who wandered too far from the trail, elderly men who stepped into the woods and forgot the way back. He understood what loss looked like. He knew its particular shape, the disorientation, the relief, the gratitude of someone who wanted to be found. What Frost pulled him toward that morning was not lost. It was something else entirely. And what they learned about her afterward, about who she was, what she had survived, and what was still coming for her, broke the hearts of every person whose hands her story passed through. Exciting and energetic. Before we get started, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. If this kind of story speaks to you, subscribe so you never miss a single one, because tomorrow I'm bringing you something just as powerful. All right, let's get into it. The fog had been sitting over the county since before dawn, the kind that doesn't burn off by mid-morning, but simply thickens and settles, swallowing the tree line and turning the familiar trail into something that required attention. George walked it anyway. He knew this stretch of forest the way you know things you've moved through hundreds of times. By feel as much as sight, the ground slope and the particular sound of the creek somewhere to the left, and the way Frost's ears moved when something worth noting was ahead. Frost had not broken a command in 5 years. Not once. Not in training. Not in the field. Not in the accumulated hours of searches that had taken him through weather and terrain, and the specific darkness of night operations in dense woodland. He was a disciplined animal in the truest sense. Not because his instincts had been suppressed, but because they had been channeled into complete trust of the man on the other end of the leash. Which was why, when he stopped mid-stride and stiffened and then tore forward without signal or permission, George understood immediately that something was wrong. He ran. The leash snapped taut and then went slack as George released it rather than be pulled off his feet, and Frost vanished in the white ahead of him, a dark shape swallowed by mist in 3 strides. George followed by sound, branches catching his jacket, his boots finding the wet moss and slipping and finding purchase again, the radio on his shoulder hissing with distance and interference, and Sergeant Dale's voice asking for a position update he didn't have time to give. He smelled it before he saw the hut. Damp wood, cold ash from a fire long dead, and underneath both of those things, something metallic, faint, specific, the kind of smell that lived at the back of the throat and didn't leave. The hut materialized from the fog like something the forest had been growing around for years, walls gray with weather, shutters split at their hinges, the door hanging at an angle from a frame that had softened and warped in the damp. Frost was at the door, scratching with focused urgency George had never heard from him, a sound that was not barking and not whining, but something between desperate, insistent, the sound of an animal communicating something it needed a human to understand. George shouldered the door open. The smell inside was stronger, cold, still. She was on the floor in the far corner, on her side, one arm curled around her abdomen with protective instinct of someone who had remained conscious long enough to make that choice and not long enough for anything after it. Young, mid-20s, perhaps. Pregnant, visibly 7 months or more. Her lips carried a particular blue of deep cold. Her hair was tangled with leaves and debris. Her coat too thin for 3 days in October woodland, and in her free hand she held a torn wool blanket, like she had been fighting to keep it across her until the last possible moment. George was on his knees beside her before his radio was in his hand. Her pulse was there, faint, slow, but there. Frost lay down without command, pressing his head gently against her side, and stayed, still and watchful in a way George had never seen from him, not in 5 years of searches, not once. George keyed the radio. Dispatch. I need medical at the old forestry trail. Sector 4. Female pregnant, hypothermic, unconscious. He looked around the hut. The stacked tins, the water jug nearly empty, the door frame with its scratched and damaged wood on the inside, where someone had worked to block it against entry. And get Sergeant Dale on the line. This woman wasn't lost. He looked back at her, at the blanket she had held until she couldn't any more. She was hiding. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was from whom, or how close that person already was, or what it would cost every one of them to find out. George confronts his superiors. Laura begins to speak the truth. The antagonist facade starts to unravel, but danger grows. The medevac was 23 minutes out. George knew this because dispatch told him twice, and because it already counted the 7 stacked with the deliberate neatness of someone rationing, and examined the water jug and calculated, from what he knew about hypothermia and exposure and the temperature overnight, that 23 minutes was a number that required him to do everything correctly between now and when the helicopter arrived. He stripped off his outer jacket and laid it across her, tucking the edges beneath her with the care of someone who understands that warmth retained is warmth that might matter. Her breathing was shallow but rhythmic. The baby's movement, a faint shift beneath his hand when he checked the position, told him something he held on to. Frost had not moved. He lay pressed against her side with his head resting near her arm, his eyes open and fixed on her face. Still in a way he was still during tracking when something important was very close. George had worked with him long enough to understand the difference between Frost at rest and Frost at attention. This was attention. Complete, deliberate, unmistakable. George sat back on his heels and looked at the hut properly for the first time. It was a forestry shelter, the old kind, built decades ago for rangers working extended sections of trail, long since decommissioned and forgotten by anyone with a budget or a maintenance schedule. The walls had gone soft with damp. The gaps in the timber stuffed with what looked like torn fabric and newspaper compressed into the cracks. The newspaper was recent enough. He could read the date on one visible section. 3 months ago. Someone had been here before today. He looked at the doorframe. At the inside of it, the wood was scratched and gouged at 2 points, hip height and lower near the floor, in a pattern consistent with something being wedged or braced against it from within. There was no furniture to barricade with. She had used her own body, he understood, and whatever she could find. The effort of it, alone and in the dark and this cold, with the weight she was carrying. He didn't let himself stay with that image long. The provisions told their own story. 7 tins, 4 of them empty, the contents gone without a utensil. She had eaten with her fingers or directly from can. A plastic lighter beside the fire pit, the fuel nearly spent. A small pile of bark and broken branch stacked with the same deliberateness as the tins. Enough for another night if she had been careful. She had been planning to stay. Or she had been planning to survive long enough to know whether staying was still an option. There was no bag, no phone visible, no identification in any pocket. He checked with gloved hands and the focus dispatched in the procedure. There was the blanket, the one she'd been holding when he found her, now repositioned beneath his jacket. And there was a thing in her closed right hand. He looked at it carefully without disturbing it. A photograph, folded twice, the edges worn soft from handling. He could see a partial image at the fold. The edge of a face, a shoulder, what might have been a child's drawing visible on a wall behind. He left it where it was. George had worked search and rescue for 5 years. He had found people in varying states of crisis, in varying degrees of deliberateness about their situation, and he had learned to read a scene the way the scene wanted to be read, not with assumption imposed on it, but with attention given to what the details actually said when arranged in sequence. The details here said one thing clearly. This woman had not stumbled into this hut. She had found it, stocked it, reinforced it against entry, and been living in it, for days at minimum, possibly longer, in conditions that would have required determined effort to endure. She was not the victim of misadventure or poor planning. She was the author of a plan that had simply run out of margin. She had been hiding with great care and at great cost. George looked at Frost still pressed against her side, in particular stillness of an animal that has decided something. He looked at the scratched wood of the door frame. He looked at the photograph folded in her closed hand. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch! I need Sergeant Dale. Not on the open channel." He paused. "And I need you to run a quiet check. Any missing persons reports filed in the last 30 days. Female, mid-20s, pregnant." Another pause. "And anything that comes back, I want to know before anyone else does." Outside, somewhere in the white fog above the trees, the distant thrum of the helicopter was beginning to grow. 23 minutes. He stayed on his knees beside her and counted her breaths and did not look away. Millhaven County Hospital was not built for emergencies of this magnitude. It was built for the ordinary medical life of a rural county. Broken bones from farm equipment, winter respiratory infections, the slow-managed decline of elderly patients who had lived their whole lives within 20 miles of where they were born. It had 11 beds, 2 operating rooms that shared a wall, and a staff of 14 whose competence had been forged not by volume, but by the particular resourcefulness of people who had learned to do more with less for a very long time. Dr. Patricia Voss met the helicopter on the pad. She was 53, precise, and had delivered babies in worse conditions than this. She took one look at Laura, still unconscious, the color of her lips beginning to shift from blue towards something closer to human, and began issuing instructions before the gurney had cleared the rotor wash. George followed them inside. He had ridden with her, one hand braced against the airframe, Frost wedged between his knees with the focused calm of an animal that had decided where it needed to be and was not open to alternatives. The paramedic had looked at the dog, looked at George, and said nothing. George had said nothing either. Frost stayed. Now he waited in the corridor outside the room where they were working on her, his back against the wall, Frost sitting at his feet, with his gaze fixed on the closed door. The sound from inside were clinical and urgent. Equipment, voices at the functional register of people managing a situation, the particular rhythm of coordinated medical effort. George listened and counted, and did not allow himself to think about the scratched door frame or the folded photograph or what the tins had told him about how long she had been out there alone. There would be time for that. The fetal monitor's sound was audible through the door. Steady, fast, persistent in the way of something that intended to continue. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. She came back slowly, the way people surface from deep cold, not all at once, but in increments, consciousness arriving before the body caught up with it. The ceiling was wrong, white flat, lit from above. She knew immediately, with the specific dread of someone whose every safe place had been a place without fluorescent light, that she was not where she had been. Her hand went to her stomach. The movement was there. She lay still for a moment and felt it, and did not cry, which required effort. Then she saw the room. She was upright enough to take in the bed, the equipment, the window showing gray afternoon sky, the 4-line running into her left arm, a hospital. The word arrived with the cold weight of everything it meant. People, questions, records, names. The door opened. She was sitting up before the thought completed itself, back pressed against the headboard, The monitor leads pulling taut. A woman in a white coat entered with both hands visible and her movements deliberate. The careful approach of someone who had done this before, who understood what sudden movement cost a room with a frightened patient. "You're safe," the woman said. "Low, even. My name is Dr. Voss. You're at Millhaven County Hospital. You've been unconscious for several hours. Your baby is stable." Laura's eyes went to the monitor, to the readout, to the number that confirmed what the woman had said. The terror did not leave, but arranged itself around that fact. The baby was stable, and she held on to it like the only fixed point in a room that was otherwise moving. "I need to leave," she said. Her voice came out wrong, thin, cracked from cold and disuse. "I need to. I can't be here. I can't be in the system. You don't understand. No one is going to make you do anything right now." Dr. Voss moved to the chair beside the bed and sat, bringing herself below eye level in a deliberate way. "You were hypothermic. Another few hours, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Right now I need you to stay still and let the fluids work. Who knows I'm here?" Laura's eyes were on the door. "Who did you call?" "The officer who found you is in the corridor. No one else has been notified beyond standard protocol." Standard protocol. She said it the way people repeat words, when the words mean something different to them than to the speaker. Something dangerous. "You have to listen to me. There's a man, if he finds out where I am." "What man?" Laura stopped. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the foreigner arm, at the monitor, at the window. "I can't," she said. Quieter now. Not refusing, calculating. The look of someone who has learned that information given to the wrong person travels faster than silence. "Not yet. Not until I know who I can trust." Dr. Voss held her gaze and did not press. Outside the door, Frost had not moved from his position in the corridor. Inside, Laura pulled a thin hospital blanket to her chest and looked at the window and listened for sounds she recognized and hoped, with the exhausted fervor of someone who has hoped before and survived the hoping, that this time was different. She did not yet know whether it was. Dr. Voss asked for a name 3 times over the course of the afternoon, not aggressively. She was not an aggressive woman, and she understood the particular arithmetic of trust in a room where a patient had already declared her intention to calculate before she spoke. She asked the first time gently. As part of an intake procedure, she narrated aloud so nothing would feel like a trap. She asked the second time practically, explaining that the chart needed something, that Jane Doe carried its own institutional implications, that a name was the smallest possible unit of information and would cost very little. The third time she didn't ask directly. She simply mentioned, while adjusting the 4 line, that the officer who had found her, a man named George Kemp, 5 years with search and rescue, the one who had ridden with her in the helicopter and was still, as far as Voss knew, sitting in the corridor, had asked twice through the door whether she was awake. The woman on the bed said nothing, but her eyes moved, just slightly, toward the door and then back to the window. And Dr. Voss, who had been reading people in hospital rooms for 30 years, noted the movement and did not remark on it. She called herself nothing. She answered to nothing. She watched every person who entered the room with the careful attention of someone mapping exits. George came in at 4 o'clock, when Dr. Voss judged that the color had returned sufficiently and the woman's blood pressure had stabilized to something that permitted a conversation, however brief. He left Frost in the corridor. The dog's presence, Voss had suggested, might help, but she wanted to introduce that idea carefully rather than fill the room with too many variables at once. He pulled a chair to a distance he judged non-threatening, far enough that she would not feel the space between them closing, close enough that she could hear him without raising his voice, and sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands open. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "I want you to know that first." She was watching him with particular assessment he had seen twice before in his career, in a man he had found after 3 days in a wilderness survival situation, and in a teenager who had been missing for a week and had reasons she hadn't shared for not wanting to be found. The look of someone running a calculation that has nothing to do with the room they're in. "I found you," he said. "Me and my dog. Nobody else was on that section of trail. I radioed dispatch after I had you stable, not before." He let that sit. "I'm telling you that so you understand the sequence." She didn't speak, but something in her shoulders shifted, not relaxation. Something more preliminary, the consideration of it. Dr. Voss had shared what she was permitted to share before George entered the room. She had framed it professionally, each item stated without interpretation, the way findings were documented, contusions on both upper arms, consistent with gripping, a healed fracture of the left wrist, improperly set, approximately 8 months old. Scar tissue at the collarbone. Older, the doctor had said, in a tone that communicated without stating directly that the age of the scar told its own story about when the pattern had begun. George looked at the woman in the bed and understood that whatever he was looking at had not happened quickly. This was not the result of a single incident or crisis with a clear timeline. This was the accumulated record of something long and sustained and endured in particular silence of someone who had calculated, correctly or not, that speaking was more dangerous than staying quiet. "The door frame," he said carefully, "in the hut. You reinforced it from the inside." He didn't ask it as a question. "That takes time. It takes planning." He paused. "You weren't running away from something that happened recently, were you?" Her jaw tightened. Her hand moved to her stomach, the same reflexive gesture he had noted on the helicopter, on the gurney, every time anything in the room changed. "The photograph," he said, even more carefully, "in your hand. You held it the whole time." Something moved in her eyes. Not willingness, not yet, but the recognition of being seen by someone who was looking at the right things. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said again. "You don't have to tell me anything today." He stood, returned the chair to its position against the wall with the same unhurried care with which he had moved the whole conversation. "But I want you to know something." He looked at her directly. "Whatever you were hiding from, you're not in that hut anymore. And I'm not going to let anyone walk through that door until you tell me you're ready." He left before she could respond. In the corridor, Frost was sitting exactly where George had left him, facing the door, steady and patient as something that made a decision and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. George leaned against the wall beside him and looked at the door and thought about the wrist fracture that had never been properly set and the scar tissue that was older than the fracture, and how long a person had to endure something before the body began to keep a record of it that couldn't be erased. He thought about the photograph. He was going to need to find out who was in it before someone else did. He arrived at 6:30 in the evening. George was in the corridor when the automatic doors at the hospital's main entrance slid open and the man walked through them, and he knew, with the same instinctive certainty with which Frost had pulled him off the trail 2 days ago, before the man had crossed the lobby, before he had spoken a single word, that this was who Laura had been hiding from. He was tall, well-dressed in the understated way of someone who has learned that money announces itself most effectively through restraint. Dark coat, clean shave, the careful composure of a man who had prepared his expression before he got out of the car. He carried nothing, no flowers, no bag, and he moved through the unfamiliar lobby with the unhurried directness of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his arrival. He stopped at the reception desk and spoke to the clerk with a smile that was warm and specific, and produced from somewhere it clearly cost him nothing to access. George watched from the corridor entrance. The clerk pointed. The man thanked her with the same smile and turned in the direction of the patient rooms, and George stepped forward and placed himself between the man and the corridor before the thought had fully completed. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes moved to the uniform, to the badge, to George's face, in a sequence that was smooth enough to look like simple orientation, and rapid enough to be something else. "I'm looking for my fiancée," he said. The voice was measured and warm. "I believe she was brought in this afternoon. Laura, I'm told there was an incident in the forest. I've been looking for her for days." He paused, and into the pause he inserted something carefully calibrated. The right amount of exhaustion, the right amount of relief at having arrived, the performance of a man at the end of a frightening search. "I'm just glad she's safe." "Your name," George said. "Daniel Marsh." He produced identification without being asked, the gesture of someone who anticipated the question and had prepared the answer as a demonstration of transparency. The ID was current, the address of City 3 County South. "And you are—" "Officer Kemp. I'm the one who found her." Something moved briefly in Marsh's eyes. Recalculation, George thought. The adjustment of a man revising his assessment of an obstacle. "Then I owe you my gratitude," he said, and it sounded entirely genuine. "Truly, she hasn't been well. The pregnancy has been difficult, and she gets frightened, confused. Sometimes. She doesn't always make the best decisions about her safety." He said it with the gentleness of concern, the careful language of a man describing a condition rather than a person. "She needs to be somewhere she's looked after." "She's being looked after," George said. "Of course. But she needs to be with family. With me." The smile again, offered this time with a slight tilt of the head that communicated patience with procedure. "I understand there are formalities. I'm happy to provide whatever documentation you need. I just want to see her." "She's resting," George said. "The doctor has restricted visitors." A beat. The smile held, but the quality behind it shifted, not breaking, not sharpening, simply registering the resistance and filing it. "I'm her next of kin. I'll pass that along to Dr. Voss." Marsh looked at him for a moment. The assessment was open this time, less concealed than before, as though he had decided George warranted a clearer reading of the dynamic between them. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "I'll wait." He moved to the waiting area and sat with the particular ease of a man who is not actually prepared to wait, but is willing to perform it for as long as the performance is useful. George returned to the corridor and took out his phone. He typed a message to Dr. Voss, man in waiting room. "Says he's her fiancé. Do not allow access until further notice." "I'll explain." And sent it. Then he stood with his back against the wall and looked through the window of the waiting area at Daniel Marsh, who had found a magazine and was turning its pages with the relaxed attention of someone with nowhere pressing to be. Frost, at George's feet, was looking through the same window. His ears were flat. In 5 years, George had seen that particular configuration twice, both times immediately before Frost located something that required urgent attention. He looked at Marsh turning a page. He looked at the dog. Then he took out his notebook and wrote down the name, the address, and the time of arrival, and began, quietly and without announcement, to think about what questions he was going to ask in the morning. Sergeant Dale arrived at 7:15 and told George that Marsh had every legal right to see her. George had been expecting this. He had also been expecting the tone, not unsympathetic, but procedural, The register of a man who operated by what the framework permitted and had not yet been given sufficient reason to look outside it. Dale was a fair man. He was also a careful one, and careful men required specific evidence before they departed from the path that kept them covered. He hasn't filed a missing persons report, George said. He says he was handling it privately. Didn't want to cause her distress. Dale's expression communicated that he found this explanation thin, but not actionable. She's conscious. She's his fiancée. We can't legally prevent him from. She hasn't confirmed that. She hasn't confirmed anything. She won't give us her name. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. George, without her cooperation, there's a limit to what we can do. Give me until morning. Dale looked at him for a long moment. They had worked together for 4 years, and Dale was a man who trusted pattern over argument. George's pattern was reliable enough. Morning, he said. I'll hold him off until morning. But if she still won't talk to us, I can't keep him out of that room indefinitely. He left. George turned back to the corridor. It was Dr. Voss who suggested it at 8 o'clock, when the shift quieted and the hospital settled into its overnight register of soft footsteps and monitored beeping. She keeps looking at the door, Voss said. Not toward it. She's monitoring it. There's a difference. She looked at George. The dog helped before. In the hut, you said. He stayed with her the whole way. Voss considered this with the practicality of a doctor who has learned to weight outcomes over policy. Bring him in. George brought Frost through the door quietly, without announcement. The dog moved into the room with the focused deliberateness he used in the field, reading the space, the smells, the particular information a room holds for an animal whose entire sensory world operates at a register humans couldn't access. He found Laura in 3 seconds and crossed the bed without hesitation and stood beside it, close but not pushing, his head at the level of her hand. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand on his head. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, not in the way of a person releasing a held breath, but in the smaller way of a person whose body makes a decision before the mind catches up. Her shoulders dropped a degree. The hand on her stomach, which had been pressed flat and tense since she woke, relaxed fractionally. He found me, she said. Not a question. He pulled me off the trail. George said, from the chair, I wouldn't have found the hut without him. She looked at Frost for a long time. The dog looked back at her with the complete, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. His name? Frost. She nodded, as though this confirmed something. Her hand moved slowly along the side of his head, and he leaned into it with the gentle pressure of an animal that had decided she was his responsibility and was communicating this in the only language available to him. It was 9 o'clock when the door at the end of the corridor opened. George heard it before he saw it. The changed quality of air pressure, footsteps that were measured and deliberate and familiar in the way of something he had been tracking at the edge of his attention all evening. He rose from the chair. Through the window set in the room's door, he saw Daniel Marsh in the corridor, speaking to a night shift orderly with the same warm composure he had deployed in the lobby, pointing toward the patient rooms. The orderly, uncertain, gestured. George opened the door. He was in the corridor before Marsh had taken 3 steps toward it, and Frost was beside him, not commanded, not leashed, simply present, which had not been George's plan. Marsh saw the dog and stopped. Frost's reaction was not aggression in the theatrical sense. It was not barking or lunging, or the displays of a poorly managed animal. It was something quieter and therefore more absolute, a low sound from deep in the chest, continuous and unwavering, every line of the dog's body oriented toward Marsh with the locked stillness of an animal that has identified something and is communicating its identification clearly. The sound filled the corridor. Marsh took a single step back. His composure held, but it held in the way of something gripping rather than something settled. The controlled stillness of a man recalculating in real time. His eyes moved from the dog to George and back. "I just want to see her," he said. The warmth was still present in his voice, but underneath it now, audible to George in the same register in which Frost had heard whatever he'd heard from the waiting room window, was the thinner note of a man whose patience with obstacles was approaching its actual limit. "She's resting," George said. "Come back in the morning." From inside the room, clearly audible through the door George had left open behind him, came a sound that was not loud and required no interpretation. Laura was crying, quietly, with the suppressed control of someone who had learned not to make noise when she was afraid. But crying. Marsh heard it. His jaw tightened once, a reflex too small and too fast to be a performance, and George filed it without expression. "Morning," George said. Marsh held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor with the measured pace of a man who has decided that tonight is not the night, but who has also, very clearly, decided that tomorrow will be. George watched him go. Frost remained at his side, the sound in his chest fading only once Marsh had pushed through the corridor door and disappeared from sight. George looked down at him, then back at the room where Laura was still crying softly, her hand on the dog's head, now replaced by her own arms wrapped around herself. In the morning, Dale would run out of reasons to hold Marsh off, which meant George had until morning to find him some. He started with the name. It was 9:30, and the hospital had gone quiet around him, and George sat in a supply room Dr. Voss had unlocked without asking why, with his laptop open on a shelf between boxes of sterile dressing, and particular focused stillness of a man who has a specific amount of time and intends to use all of it correctly. Daniel Marsh. The address on the ID was a city 3 counties south. George ran it through the standard databases first: driver's license, vehicle registration, property records. The license came back clean. The vehicle was registered to a holding company called Arrowway Property Group. The address on the ID returned a commercial building, not a residence. He wrote that down. He searched Arrowway Property Group. It existed, incorporated 4 years ago, active, a modest portfolio of residential rental properties across 2 counties. The registered director was not Daniel Marsh. It was a woman named Caroline Marsh, listed as sole director, addressed the same commercial building. He searched Caroline Marsh. She appeared in property records going back 6 years, in business filings, in a single local news article from 3 years ago about a planning dispute involving one of the rental properties. The article included a photograph. A woman in her 50s, composed, unremarkable. No connection to a Daniel Marsh that he could find in any public record. He sat with that for a moment. Then he changed his search. He went back to the missing persons database, the same quiet check he had requested through dispatch the morning he found Laura, and looked at it properly this time, not for her description alone, but for the surrounding pattern. Women, late 20s to mid-30s, pregnant or recently postpartum, reported missing in the county south of Millhaven over the past 4 years. There were 3. The first 2 years ago. A woman named Sophia Renner, 29, 8 months pregnant, reported missing by her partner. Name redacted in the summary file, pending investigation. Found 3 weeks later at a women's shelter in a neighboring state. She had declined to press charges. The file was closed. The second, 18 months ago, a woman named Marie Cathcart, 31, 6 months pregnant, reported missing by a family member, not a partner. Found 11 days later. Location of discovery redacted. Status: case open. No further updates logged in 14 months. The third, 7 months ago. A woman named Petra Vane, 27, not pregnant at the time of the report, but listed as having given birth 3 months prior. Reported missing by no one. The file had been opened by a hospital social worker who had noted concerns and filed independently. Status: unresolved. Last known location: not recorded. 3 women, 3 open or nominally closed files with a particular thinness of cases that had been processed rather than investigated. Documented sufficiently to exist and insufficiently to go anywhere. George looked at the dates. The geography, the consistent presence of a partner or associated male figure in 2 of the 3 cases, redacted in both. He went back to the Arrowway Property Group and cross-referenced its rental addresses against the last known locations recorded in the 3 files. 2 matches. He sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called a contact he had at the county records office. A woman named Paula, who had helped him with document verification twice before, and who answered on the 4th ring with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to being called after hours. He asked her to pull the incorporation documents for Arrowway Property Group and cross-reference the signatory history against any name variant of Daniel Marsh. She called back in 11 minutes. The original incorporation documents, filed 4 years ago, listed a co-director who had been removed from the filing 8 months later. The removal was standard procedure, documented correctly, entirely legal. The original co-director's name was Daniel Harrow. George typed the name. The results loaded in under 3 seconds. Daniel Harrow, 41, 2 civil disputes settled out of court in the past 5 years, a restraining order filed and subsequently withdrawn 18 months ago by a woman whose name matched the second file, Marie Cathcart, and a current address that was not the commercial building, but a residential property 40 minutes from Millhaven. 40 minutes. He had been in the hospital lobby at 6:30, which meant he had not driven from his registered address, which meant he had been closer than that, which meant he had known, before he walked through those doors, approximately where Laura was. George closed the laptop. He looked at the time. It was 20 past 10. He thought about the restraining order filed and withdrawn, about Marie Cathcart, status unresolved, about the way Marsh Harrow had said she doesn't always make the best decisions about her safety with the fluency of a man who had said a version of that sentence many times before, about more than one woman. He picked up his phone and called Dale. "I need you to run a name," he said, when Dale answered. "Daniel Harrow. And I need you to pull the Cathcart file from 18 months ago." He paused. "And Dale, when you see what I'm about to send you, I need you to believe it." He photographed his notes with the phone and sent them before Dale could respond. Then he went back to the corridor outside Laura's room and stood with Frost in the quiet dark of the hospital at night and waited to see whether the system would do what it was built to do, or whether he was going to have to find another way. She was awake when he came back. He knew before he opened the door. The light beneath it had a different quality, the particular stillness of a room with a conscious person in it rather than a sleeping one. He knocked anyway, 2 soft knocks, and waited for her to say, "Come in." She was sitting up against the headboard with Frost beside her on the narrow hospital bed in a configuration that should not have fit, and somehow did, his head across her legs, her hand resting on his back with the absent ease of someone who has stopped thinking about whether to allow the comfort and simply accepted it. The monitor beeped. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the faint animal warmth of the dog. George pulled the chair close and sat. "He was here earlier," she said. Not a question. She had heard him in the corridor. "He's gone for the night." She absorbed this with the particular quality of someone calculating a window, how much time it represented, what could fit inside it. "He'll come back." "Yes," George said. He had learned, in the hours since he'd found her, that honesty costs less with lure than reassurance. She heard the difference between them instantly, and the cost of reassurance, when it failed, was greater than the discomfort of the truth delivered plainly. "In the morning. I'm working on reasons to delay that." She looked at him for a long moment. "His name isn't Daniel Marsh," George said. Something crossed her face. Not surprise. Recognition. The particular expression of someone hearing confirmed what they already knew, but had not yet said aloud. "Harrow," she said quietly. "Daniel Harrow." She looked down at Frost. Her hand moved slowly along his back. "He uses different names. He has for years. He has documents. I don't know how. I never knew how. Passports, licenses, credit histories. Whole identities that exist completely." She paused. "He's good at it, at making things look like whatever he needs them to look like." "How long?" George asked. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain had begun against the window, soft and specific, the kind that would make the forest floor slick by morning. "I met him 4 years ago," she said. "He was different at the beginning. They always are, I think, different. I've talked to enough women, in enough bad situations to know that. A beat, it started small, the way it always does. He didn't like a friend of mine. Then he didn't like my job. Then it was easier not to see my sister than to manage the consequences of seeing her." She stopped. "By the time I understood what happened, I didn't have anyone left to call." George said nothing. He had learned when to speak, and when the silence was doing more than words could. "He took my phone 18 months ago," she said. "Not overtly. He just replaced it. New number, new account in his name. Every contact transferred by him. Everything I sent or received went through him first." She looked at the window. "I didn't tell anyone. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't sound manageable. People hear these things and think, why didn't she just leave? As though leaving is a thing you can simply decide. The risk," George said carefully. She turned her left arm over, looked at it. "I fell," she said, with the flat intonation of a sentence that has been said enough times that the irony has worn off it entirely. "That's what the records say, if there are records. He was very careful about records." She paused. "He's always been very careful." She didn't say the rest. Not yet. George could see it. The shape of what she was holding back, the fuller account that lived beyond the fragments she was releasing. But he didn't reach for it. She was giving him what she could manage, and he understood that managing it was costing her. "The photograph," he said, "in your hand when I found you." Her jaw tightened. Her arms moved around herself the way they did whenever something touched the deepest part of it. "My daughter," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "She's 2. He has her." A long pause in which the monitor beeped and the rain continued, and Frost pressed closer against her side. "That's why I ran. And that's why I can't stay hidden forever." She looked at George directly, for the first time since he had sat down, with the particular clarity of someone who has arrived at the sentence they have been building toward. "I'm not just running from him. I'm trying to get her back." George held her gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands open and said, Then let's talk about how we do that. She looked at him, at Frost, at the rain against the window, and for the first time since she had barricaded herself inside a rotting hut in the fog and waited to see whether the world would find her or he would, she told someone else the weight she had been carrying. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to begin. Dale called at 11:47. George had been expecting the call. He had not been certain of its tone, whether Dale would come back with the careful neutrality of a man who had looked at the information and found it insufficient, or with something different. He listened to the first 3 sentences and understood it was something different. The Cathcart file, Dale said without preamble. 18 months ago, the restraining order she filed and withdrew, I pulled the original application. The name she filed against was Daniel Harrow. Same address as the property we're looking at. A pause. She withdrew it 8 days after filing. The withdrawal was filed by her attorney of record. I called the attorney. She says Cathcart came into her office in person. Said she wanted to drop it, seemed, and I'm quoting, very certain and very frightened simultaneously. George said nothing. He was writing. The Vane file, Dale continued. Petra Vane, 7 months ago. I got the social worker who opened it. She's still at the hospital that filed the original concern. She says Vane had a 3-month-old and had been admitted twice in 6 weeks, once for a fractured rib attributed to a fall, once for a laceration on her forearm attributed to a kitchen accident. He paused. Social worker says she tried to follow up 3 times. First 2 times, a man answered the door and told her Vane was resting. 3rd time, no answer. The file went inactive. Was the man identified? Described as tall, dark coat, polite. No name recorded. Another pause. George. The property records I pulled on the Harrow residential address, the one 40 minutes out. It's been in use for 3 months. Before that, he was at a different address. I'm looking at the lease history, and there are 4 properties in 3 counties over 5 years, all short-term leases, all terminated cleanly. He moves, George said, regularly, and always to somewhere within a county or 2 of an active missing persons file. I can now connect to him. Dale's voice had shifted. Not dramatically, but in the way of a man who's been fair for 30 years encountering something that tests the limits of fairness. That's not coincidence. No, George said. It isn't. There's more. A sound of paper. I asked Paulette Records to pull everything connected to Arrowway Property Group, one of the rental addresses, managed under that company, 2 years ago, was the last known address for Sophia Renner. The first file, 3 for 3. George sat with that for a moment in the supply room, the laptop open in front of him, the rain still audible against the hospital's external walls. He finds them through the properties, George said. It was arriving as he said it, the shape of it becoming clear. He controls their housing, which means he controls whether they have somewhere to go if they leave, which means leaving requires going somewhere with no address, no record, no. A hut in the woods, Dale said quietly. A hut in the woods. The silence between them held the weight of what they were both understanding. I'm coming in, Dale said. Tonight, I'll bring what I have. You bring yours. George ended the call and opened the laptop again. He had one more thread he had not yet pulled, the thing that had been sitting at the edge of his thinking since he had found the address discrepancy, since he had understood that Harrow had arrived at the hospital already knowing approximately where Laura was. He searched for cellular tower data requests filed by law enforcement in the region over the past 3 weeks, public record at the summary level, enough to see whether anyone had been running location traces, in the corridor of forest between Harrow's address and Millhaven. The summary results loaded slowly. There were 2 requests, both filed under a law enforcement agency from the county south of Millhaven, both pertaining to a cell number he didn't recognize. He stared at the number. Then he went back to Laura's file, the thin one dispatch had assembled from the ID check. The number listed as her emergency contact was different, but the number on the cell data request was a variant of it, 1 digit transposed, not her number. Close enough to suggest someone had been looking for her number and had run an adjacent search when the primary didn't return results. He had been hunting her digitally for at least 3 weeks before she surfaced in the forest, which meant the hunt had not been accidental. She had found a place with no signal, no address, no record, and she had gotten there just ahead of him. George closed the laptop and walked back to the corridor and stood outside Laura's door. Through the small window, he could see her still sitting up against the headboard, Frost beside her, her hand moving slowly along his back in the rhythm of someone trying to stay calm. She had known he was coming. She had run as far as she could run, and he had found the hospital before the night was over. George looked at his watch. Dale would be here in 20 minutes. They had the evidence. What they needed now was for the system to move faster than the man who had spent 5 years learning to stay 1 step ahead of it. He pressed his back against the wall and watched the door and waited. Frost's ears, visible through the window, were flat. The hunter was still out there, and morning was only hours away. Dale arrived at 12:15 with a folder and the expression of a man who had made a decision on the drive over. They spread everything across the supply room shelf. George's notes, Dale's pulled files, the printed summary of the cellular data, the incorporation documents with Harrow's name appearing and disappearing across 4 years of carefully managed paper, laid out in sequence, cross-referenced. It had the particular quality of evidence that has reached critical mass. Not a single damning document, but a pattern so consistent and so specific that the only explanation requiring fewer assumptions and deliberate criminal conduct was no explanation at all. Dale looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "You were working with what you had." George said, "I was working with what he gave me." Dale picked up the Cathcart restraining order. A polished story and a clean record. He's constructed both very carefully. He set it down. "I called the department south of Millhaven, the agency that filed the cellular data requests." A pause. "The requests were filed under detective's name. I spoke to the detective. He has no knowledge of those filings. Someone used his credentials." George went still. "Harrow has someone inside. Had, or has access to someone's login. I've passed it to the state office. It's above our level now, which is either good news or the kind of good news that takes 6 weeks to become useful." Dale looked at him steadily. "Which means we can't wait for the state office." "No," George said. "We can't." He went to Laura at 1 a.m, when the hospital was as quiet as it would get, and the corridor outside her room held no one but Frost, still at his post, ears moving when George rounded the corner and settling again when he recognized the footsteps. She was awake. She had been awake, he thought, most of the night. He told her what they had found. He did it in the same plain sequence he used for everything. The property connections of 3 women, the cellular data, the compromised credentials. He watched her face as he spoke and saw the particular expression of someone receiving confirmation of things they already knew, but had never had returned to them as documented fact. There was something almost unbearable about it. The relief of being believed pressing against the weight of understanding that the danger was more extensive than even she had known. He has someone in law enforcement, she said when he finished. We think so. Possibly historical access, rather than a current relationship. We're working on understanding the extent. She absorbed this. Then she reached the bedside table and picked up the folded photograph, the one she had held in the hut in the helicopter through every hour since, and held it without opening it. Her name is Iris, she said. She'll be 2 in March. She looked at the photograph. He told me she was with his sister. I don't know if that's true. I don't know where she is. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has decided that steadiness is a form of protection and has been maintaining it for a very long time. Everything I've done since I left, the route I took, the cash I used, the hut, all of it was to get somewhere I could surface safely without him knowing first. Somewhere I could tell someone the truth before he got to shape the version they heard. You did that, George said. You're doing it now. She looked at him. Is it enough? He thought about the pattern in the files. About 5 years of careful construction, the names, the properties, the women who had withdrawn complaints and gone quiet, about the credentials compromised and the cellular searches and the 40-minute drive. That meant he had already been close. It's a beginning, George said, and beginnings matter. She nodded slowly. Then she unfolded the photograph for the first time in his presence and held it so he could see it. A small girl, dark-haired, mid-laugh, caught in particular unguarded joy of a child who does not yet know the world can be the kind of place her mother has been navigating. Behind her, just visible at the edge of the frame, was a yellow curtain George didn't recognize. He looked at it carefully, filed it. I'm going to find her, he said, not a reassurance. A statement of intent, delivered with the same plainness he brought to everything that mattered. No performance, no qualification, just the way the thing he intended be true. Laura looked at him for a long moment. Then she refolded the photograph and held it in both hands and said nothing, because some things don't require an answer, only a witness. In the corridor, Frost raised his head. Down the hall, the automatic door slid open. Footsteps, measured, familiar. George rose from his chair and moved to the door and looked through the window into the corridor. Dale was already there, hand raised, stopping the figure who had come through the entrance at 1 a.m. with composure, a man who believed, still, that the night could be managed. Harrow stopped. He looked at Dale, then through the window at George. His expression did not change, but his eyes, calculating, rapid, the true instrument behind the polished surface, moved once to the room where Laura was, and then back to George, and in that movement was the first visible evidence of something George had been waiting for since the lobby. The facade, for just 1 second, showed its age. It held. He recovered it quickly, smoothed it back into place with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. But George had seen it. Dale had seen it. And somewhere in the supply room down the corridor, the folder on the shelf contained enough of the truth that the recovery, however practiced, was the last time it would come easily. The truth had found its witness. What came next would be difficult and dangerous and long, but it had begun. Exciting and energetic, you made it to the end, and I appreciate you more than you know. Now, if you thought the story was something, the next one is going to blow your mind completely. Wilder, deeper and more emotional than anything you have seen on this channel yet. Go watch it right now. It is waiting for you.